Ethan Collins had always valued his self-reliance. A man in his early 40s with a subdued yet authoritative demeanor, he resided in the house his deceased father had bequeathed to him on the fringes of a suburban enclave. The residence was aged, featuring worn bricks and a drooping porch roof, but it was his sanctuary. The true highlight of Ethan's property, however, wasn't the house itself, but the Mustang GT stationed beneath the handcrafted wooden carport in his driveway. The vehicle was more than just an automobile. It was integral to his persona, a link to his late father who had taught him the intricacies of rebuilding engines, fixing bodywork, and breathing life into corroded metal relics. Over the years, Ethan had dedicated himself to restoring the 1970 Mustang GT, transforming it from a dilapidated shell into a flawless, throaty powerhouse. The Mustang's glossy midnight blue finish shimmered under the sunlight, and its engine growled like a beast ready to unleash. Every aspect, from the shiny chrome bumpers to the meticulously sewn leather interior, showcased Ethan's meticulousness and commitment. Neighbors frequently slowed their vehicles to admire it as they passed by his home, though Ethan himself seldom interacted with them. He wasn't fond of casual conversations or community gatherings. He cherished his solitude, spending his nights working with tools in his modest garage or lounging on his porch with a cold drink, watching the sunset. The neighborhood had evolved over time. What was once a peaceful, loosely knit area of independent homeowners had gradually been overtaken by the ever-growing influence of the SAA, or Suburban Association Authority. Ethan had resisted every effort by the SAA to incorporate his property into their jurisdiction. He had no desire to adhere to their bylaws, regulations, or endless stipulations regarding grass height, fence color, or the community's visual harmony. His father had constructed their home long before the SAA existed, and Ethan was steadfast in maintaining that legacy. However, the SAA, headed by the stern and relentless Margaret Hayes, viewed the situation differently. Margaret, in her late 50s with a sharply styled bob haircut and a constant air of superiority, saw herself as the neighborhood's guardian of order and aesthetics. She drove a silver SUV adorned with a bumper sticker that read "Proud SAA President," and her clipboard seemed almost permanently attached to her hand. Margaret's objective was straightforward: bring every residence under the SAA's control, and Ethan's property was a glaring exception on her otherwise immaculate roster. Ethan had previously encountered Margaret, typically resulting in brief and unpleasant interactions. Once, she had stormed up his driveway uninvited, clipboard in hand, to inform him that his carport didn't meet the neighborhood's aesthetic criteria. Ethan, who was engrossed in working on the Mustang at the time, had barely glanced at her before responding that he wasn't interested. She had persisted, mentioning some vague community unity initiative, but Ethan had simply walked into his house and closed the door. That incident had occurred 2 years prior, and Margaret's persistence had only intensified since then. More recently, Ethan had started noticing odd occurrences. Flyers from the SAA began appearing in his mailbox, despite him not being a member. One day, a brightly colored brochure announced that all properties in the vicinity were being reassessed for compliance with the new community standards. On another occasion, he discovered a note affixed to his front door, courteously reminding him to mow his lawn, even though his grass was impeccably trimmed. The most disturbing event, however, was when Ethan found a typed letter stuck under the windshield wiper of the Mustang. The letter read, "Your vehicle does not comply with community standards for appearance and safety. Please remove it within 7 days to avoid further action." Ethan had chuckled upon reading it, crumpling the paper and discarding it. Who were they to dictate what he did with his car? He wasn't part of their SAA, and his property was legally outside their jurisdiction. It was merely another petty attempt by Margaret to assert control, and Ethan chose not to engage. But Margaret Hayes was not someone who accepted refusal lightly. Behind her polished facade and cheerful discourse about community values lay a ruthless edge. To Margaret, Ethan's defiance wasn't just irritating, it was a challenge. She viewed his Mustang as a flaw in her perfect neighborhood vision and was determined to eliminate it by any means necessary. For Ethan, life continued as usual. He spent his weekends detailing the Mustang or taking it out for leisurely drives along rural roads. The engine's roar always seemed to clear his mind. He was a man not easily disturbed, believing the SAA's antics would eventually subside. Yet, a growing unease lingered in the back of his mind. Margaret's persistence felt different this time, as though she was orchestrating something more significant. Then, one morning, Ethan found a new note on his front door. Unlike the previous letters, this one wasn't typed or printed. It was handwritten in a neat, flowing script, and the tone was far less formal. "You've been warned. Remove that eyesore or we will." Ethan's jaw tightened as he read the incomplete message. It wasn't just the threat that unsettled him. The implication was clear. Margaret or someone on her behalf wasn't bluffing. They were escalating their efforts. Ethan decided he'd had enough. He grabbed the note and drove straight to the SAA's office, a neat building on the neighborhood's edge resembling a small courthouse. Inside, Margaret was seated at her desk, conversing with a younger man who seemed to be a new recruit. She barely glanced up when Ethan entered, but when he placed the note on her desk, her demeanor shifted. "What is this, Margaret?" she asked, her voice oozing feigned innocence. "You tell me," Ethan replied. "This appeared on my door this morning." Margaret picked up the note, her eyes narrowing as she read it. "I have no idea who wrote this," she said, returning it to the desk. "But I can assure you our association operates strictly within legal boundaries." "Save it," Ethan shot back. "I'm not part of your SAA, and I never will be. Stay off my property." Margaret's lips curled into a tight smile. "You know, Mr. Collins, it's a pity you don't recognize the value of being part of a community. But I suppose some people just aren't team players." Ethan leaned in closer. "This isn't about community. It's about you trying to control something that isn't yours. Leave me and my property alone." Margaret remained silent, but the glint in her eye indicated she wasn't yielding. As Ethan left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. Unbeknownst to him, the struggle for his Mustang and his independence was about to escalate into something dark and destructive. The morning began like any other for Ethan Collins. The sun was just rising, casting a golden hue over the trees lining his tranquil street. Ethan stood in his kitchen, sipping his coffee while casually glancing out the window at his cherished Mustang GT. Even from inside, he could see the sunlight reflecting off the freshly polished hood. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace, a small break from the tension that had been mounting between him and Margaret Hayes. The note from the previous day still lay on his counter, a stark reminder that the SAA's interference had reached a new level of hostility. He was about to step outside to check on the car when he felt a subtle tremor beneath his feet. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the vibration intensified, accompanied by a low mechanical rumble. Frowning, Ethan set down his mug and stepped onto the porch. That's when he saw it, a massive yellow bulldozer rolling down the street, its enormous blade gleaming in the early morning light. At the controls, seated high above the chaos like a monarch overseeing her realm, was Margaret Hayes. Ethan froze, his mind racing to comprehend what he was witnessing. The bulldozer slowed as it neared his driveway, then came to a halt directly in front of the Mustang. Margaret sat motionless for a moment, her hands gripping the controls as she fixed her cold, predator-like gaze on the car. Then, without warning, she pressed the controls forward. "Hey, stop!" Ethan shouted, rushing down the steps of his porch. But Margaret either didn't hear him or chose to ignore him. The bulldozer surged forward, its massive blade crashing into the Mustang with a thunderous impact. Ethan's heart sank. The sound of bending metal and shattering glass filled the air as the blade tore through the car's front, ripping apart the hood and exposing the engine beneath. Margaret didn't slow down. She pressed harder, her expression unchanged as the Mustang was pushed backward into the wooden beams of the carport. "Margaret, are you insane?" Ethan yelled, sprinting toward the driveway. Margaret finally brought the bulldozer to a stop. She climbed down from the cab with calculated grace, brushing off non-existent dust from her blazer before turning to face Ethan. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. Ethan stormed toward her, his fists clenched. What the hell do you think you're doing? Margaret raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. I'm enforcing community standards. Your vehicle was a clear violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. It had to be removed. Ethan stared at her in disbelief, his chest heaving with anger. You don't have the authority to do this. I'm not part of your SAA. Margaret's lips curled into a smug smile. Ah, but that's where you're mistaken. As of last month, the neighborhood boundaries were officially redrawn to include your property. You're now under our jurisdiction. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Ethan. Here's the updated map, along with the new bylaws. You'll see it's all perfectly legal. Ethan snatched the paper from her hands and unfolded it. The map did show his property marked as part of the SAA's territory, but he didn't believe it for a second. This was Margaret's doing, another one of her manipulative power plays to force him into compliance. This is bullshit, he said, crumpling the paper and tossing it to the ground. You can't just redraw boundaries and act like you own my property. Margaret tilted her head, her smile unwavering. The bylaws are quite clear, Mr. Collins. As a member of the SAA, you're required to maintain your property in accordance with community standards. Your car was an eyesore and posed a safety risk. I took appropriate action. Ethan took a step closer, towering over her. That car was on my private property. You had no right to touch it. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a hint of irritation surfaced in her voice. You can argue all you want, but the fact remains that your vehicle is gone. If you have a problem, I suggest you take it up with our legal team. Before Ethan could respond, Margaret turned and walked back toward the bulldozer. She climbed into the cab and gave him one last look, her smug expression firmly in place. Have a nice day, Mr. Collins, she said before driving off, leaving behind a trail of crushed metal and splintered wood. Ethan stood there, his mind swirling with fury and disbelief. His Mustang, the car he had invested years of effort into restoring, was now nothing more than a mangled heap of steel. He felt a deep, primal rage bubbling within him, but beneath it lay an even more profound pain. That car had been more than just a vehicle. It was a part of his life, a connection to his father, and a symbol of his independence. He turned back toward the wreckage, his fists still clenched. The carport was a total loss, its beams splintered and sagging under the weight of the destruction. The Mustang's front end was completely crushed, the engine exposed and warped beyond recognition. Ethan crouched beside the car, running his hand over the jagged edges of the hood. For a moment he sat there, trying to process what had happened. But Ethan wasn't one to succumb to defeat. As the initial shock began to fade, his anger transformed into determination. Margaret Hayes had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. He stood up, his jaw set in resolve, and pulled out his phone. The first call he made was to the police. He explained what had happened, detailing how Margaret had trespassed onto his property and destroyed his car. The dispatcher listened politely, but informed him that property disputes involving the SAA were considered civil matters and would need to be resolved in court. Ethan hung up, muttering under his breath. Next, he called his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rebecca Turner. Rebecca listened intently as Ethan recounted the morning's events, her voice steady and calm as she assured him they had a case. If she destroyed your property without your consent, that's criminal damage, Rebecca said. We'll start by filing a police report, and then we'll examine the legality of those boundary changes she mentioned. I'll need copies of any documents she's given you. Ethan agreed, but as he ended the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that the law might not be sufficient to stop Margaret. She had already shown she was willing to play dirty, and he had no doubt she'd continue to do so. He needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Standing amidst the wreckage of his driveway, Ethan made a silent vow to himself. Margaret Hayes wanted a confrontation. She was about to get one, and this time, he wasn't backing down. Ethan spent the remainder of the day surrounded by the debris of his beloved Mustang, his mind racing with questions and anger simmering just below the surface. The sharp scent of motor oil and splintered wood lingered in the air, a constant reminder of what had been taken from him. Margaret Hayes had overstepped, and though the police had dismissed his complaint as a civil matter, Ethan wasn't going to let this go unanswered. He paced back and forth in his small garage, hands clenching and unclenching as he strategized his next move. The first step was gathering evidence. Margaret had been bold enough to operate the bulldozer herself in broad daylight, but Ethan knew she would try to manipulate the situation in her favor. He accessed the footage from the security camera mounted on the corner of his house. It took a moment for the video to load, but when it did, Ethan felt a surge of vindication. The footage was crystal clear, showing the bulldozer entering his property, Margaret seated confidently at the controls, her expression one of cold determination. The video captured every second of the destruction, the Mustang being crushed under the massive blade, the carport splintering under the assault, and Margaret exiting the cab with her smug, unshakable demeanor. Ethan saved the video and uploaded a copy to a secure cloud drive. He didn't trust Margaret or the SAA to refrain from retaliation, and he needed to ensure this evidence was safe. He also photographed the wreckage from every angle, documenting the extent of the damage to both the car and the property. With this substantial evidence, he felt confident he had a strong case against her, but evidence alone wouldn't stop Margaret. She wasn't the type to relent, and Ethan knew she'd likely start plotting her next move. And that thought was confirmed later that evening when he found another letter taped to his front door. This one bore the SAA's official letterhead and read, Shengna, ***, Dear Mr. Collins. Yea. As previously communicated, your vehicle was found to be in violation of community standards due to its unsafe and unsightly condition. In accordance with Section 14B of the SAA bylaws, immediate action was taken to rectify the situation. The removal of the vehicle was necessary to maintain the aesthetic and safety standards of our neighborhood. Should you have any further concerns, you may submit a formal complaint to the SAA board within 30 days. Please note that failure to comply with future directives may result in additional enforcement measures. Sincerely, Margaret Hayes, SAA President. Ethan crumpled the letter in his fist, his teeth grinding as he read Margaret's smug justification. The audacity of her words infuriated him. She was attempting to portray her reckless destruction of his property as a necessary act, hiding behind the facade of SAA regulations he'd never agreed to. Ethan tossed the crumpled paper onto the counter, glaring at it as though it might ignite from his fury. He needed to understand exactly how Margaret had pulled this off. If she was claiming his property now fell under SAA jurisdiction, there had to be paperwork somewhere to support it, or at least something she could use to feign legitimacy. He decided to head straight to the source, the SAA's office. The next morning, Ethan drove to the unassuming building on the neighborhood's edge where the SAA was headquartered. The place was eerily quiet, the parking lot nearly empty. Ethan parked his truck and stepped inside, the faint scent of disinfectant greeting his nose as he walked through the door. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up from her computer as he approached. "I need to speak with Margaret Hayes," Ethan said, his voice clipped and tense. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his tone. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Ethan replied, "but I'm not leaving until I talk to her." The receptionist sighed and picked up the phone, muttering something Ethan couldn't hear. A moment later, Margaret emerged from a back office, her expression calm but with a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Mr. Collins?" she said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't waste any time. "I want to know how you're claiming my property is under your jurisdiction. Show me the documents." Margaret gestured toward a small conference room. "Why don't we discuss this privately?" Ethan followed her into the room, his jaw tight as she closed the door behind them. Margaret took a seat at the head of the table, opening a sleek leather folder and pulling out a series of papers. She slid one across the table toward Ethan. "This," she said, tapping the document with a perfectly manicured nail, "is the updated neighborhood map approved by the city planning office last month. As you can see, your property now falls within the SAA boundaries. It's all perfectly legal. Ethan picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the map and the accompanying text. The map clearly marked his property within the newly expanded SAA territory, but something about it felt off. The lines appeared hastily drawn, and the accompanying approval stamp seemed too faint, almost as if it had been photocopied. "Let me guess," Ethan said, dropping the paper back onto the table. "You pulled some strings with your contacts in City Hall to get this approved. How much did it cost you?" Margaret's smile didn't falter. "Mr. Collins, I assure you everything was done according to proper channels. If you have an issue, you're welcome to take it up with the city. But as of now, your property is part of the SAA, and you're expected to comply with our standards." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You destroyed my car, Margaret. That wasn't enforcement. That was criminal. You think I'm just going to let that slide?" Margaret's smile tightened and her tone grew sharper. "I acted within the authority granted to me by the SAA. If you choose to pursue this, I'm afraid you'll find yourself on the losing side. The bylaws are very clear." Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. Instead, he stood up and turned toward the door. "This isn't over," he said without looking back. As Ethan left the office, his mind was already racing with plans. Margaret had made a mistake by showing him that the map was exactly the kind of sloppy, rushed work he could expose. If she thought her connections and flimsy paperwork were enough to protect her, she was in for a rude awakening. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, poring over every piece of evidence he had gathered so far. The security footage, the photos of the wreckage, the suspicious map, all of it painted a clear picture of Margaret's overreach and corruption. But he knew he needed more. He needed to uncover exactly how she'd managed to push this boundary change through and who else might be involved. Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Rebecca Turner, his lawyer. "Got your email? Reviewing everything now. This looks strong. Keep digging." Ethan nodded to himself, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for his car or his property anymore. This was about standing up to a bully who had operated unchecked for too long. Margaret Hayes had declared war, and Ethan was ready to retaliate. The days following Ethan's tense confrontation with Margaret Hayes were a whirlwind of frustration and determination. Ethan spent countless hours trying to piece together how she had managed to include his property in the SAA's boundaries. The so-called updated map she had shown him was undoubtedly fraudulent, but proving that would take more than just a hunch. It required hard evidence and meticulous work. Every night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and stacks of papers spread out before him. He sifted through public records, city zoning approvals, and anything else he could find about the SAA's jurisdiction. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. The SAA had expanded its boundaries twice in the past 5 years, each time annexing small properties on the edges of its original territory. Most of those properties had been sold off shortly afterward, often to the same real estate development company, Silverstone Developments. Silverstone was a name Ethan recognized. They were notorious for demolishing older homes and replacing them with upscale uniform houses, the kind that sold for triple the price of their construction costs. The company had been linked to shady practices in the past, including pressuring homeowners to sell and using questionable zoning changes to force people out. Ethan couldn't prove it yet, but he was certain Margaret was working with them. His property, with its old house and large lot, was likely a prime target for redevelopment. One evening, as Ethan scrolled through Silverstone's corporate filings, he spotted a familiar name in the list of their local consultants, Daniel Hayes. His stomach churned. Daniel Hayes was Margaret's husband. Suddenly, everything made sense. Margaret wasn't just enforcing SAA rules. She was actively clearing the way for her husband's business interests. The destruction of Ethan's Mustang wasn't about aesthetics or safety. It was a calculated move to intimidate him into selling his property. Armed with this new connection, Ethan reached out to Rebecca Turner, his lawyer. When he informed her about the link between Margaret and Silverstone, Rebecca's voice took on a sharper edge. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can prove a conflict of interest or show that Margaret is using her position for personal gain, we can bring her down. but we'll need solid evidence. Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll get it, he said. Whatever it takes. The next day, Ethan decided to take a more direct approach. He knew Margaret wouldn't be careless enough to leave incriminating evidence lying around the SAA office, but there was another potential source of information at her house. Margaret lived in one of the largest homes in the neighborhood, a sprawling two-story colonial with manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Ethan had driven past it many times, but this time he parked his truck a block away and approached on foot. It was late, and most of the neighborhood was dark, save for a few porch lights and the occasional flicker of a TV in a window. Margaret's house, however, was well lit, with lights on both floors and a faint glow emanating from the backyard. Ethan crouched behind a row of bushes, his heart pounding as he watched for any sign of movement. Margaret's SUV was parked in the driveway, but her husband's car was missing. Ethan waited, tense and alert, until he saw Margaret step out onto the porch. She stood there for a moment, sipping from a glass of wine and gazing out at the street. Ethan held his breath, remaining as still as possible. After a few minutes, she went back inside and the porch light flicked off. Ethan waited another half hour to ensure she was asleep before making his move. He crept around to the back of the house, where he'd noticed a home office during one of his previous drives-by. The window was slightly open, letting in the cool night air. Ethan peered inside and saw a desk cluttered with papers, a laptop, and a filing cabinet. His first instinct was to climb inside and start searching, but he hesitated. Breaking into her house would cross a line, and if he got caught, it would only give Margaret ammunition against him. Instead, Ethan pulled out his phone and zoomed in through the window, snapping photos of the desk and its contents. One of the documents caught his eye. It was labeled Silverstone Development's projected plans. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He couldn't see the details from his vantage point, but it was enough to prove that Margaret was working directly with Silverstone. If he could obtain that document, he might be able to connect the dots between Margaret, the SAA's boundary changes, and the destruction of his Mustang. Ethan retreated, carefully retracing his steps back to the street. As he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he quickened his pace. The following morning, Ethan sent the photos to Rebecca. "This is a start," she said, "but we need to get those documents. I'll file a subpoena, but that could take weeks. In the meantime, we should look for other ways to pressure Margaret." Ethan knew exactly where to begin. He reached out to some of his neighbors, people who had lived in the area long enough to remember what the neighborhood was like before the SAA took control. One of them, an older man named Frank, had been forced to sell his property 5 years ago when the SAA declared his home unsafe due to minor code violations. "They wouldn't leave me alone," Frank said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Every week it was something new, a fine for overgrown bushes, a warning about my fence being too short. They just wore me down until I gave up and sold. I didn't know it at the time, but the company that bought my house was tied to Silverstone. I bet they'd been pulling the strings all along." Frank's story was eerily similar to what Ethan was experiencing, solidifying his resolve to expose Margaret. He spent the next few days gathering testimonies from other neighbors who had been pressured or bullied by the SAA. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a clear picture of systemic abuse and corruption. As the evidence mounted, Margaret seemed to grow more desperate. One night, Ethan returned home to find his driveway blocked by a large pile of debris, broken branches, scraps of wood, and even an old mattress. A note taped to the pile read, "Keep pushing, and this will seem like nothing." Ethan's blood boiled, but he refused to let her intimidate him. Instead, he called a local waste removal company and had the debris hauled away the next morning. When the workers asked where to dispose of it, Ethan didn't hesitate. "Take it to the SAA office," he said. The gesture was petty, but it sent a message that Ethan wasn't backing down. The tipping point came later that week when Rebecca called him with urgent news. "We just accessed some of Silverstone's internal documents," she said. There's a paper trail showing they've been funneling money to Margaret in exchange for pushing boundary changes and clearing properties for redevelopment. This is the smoking gun we needed. Ethan felt a surge of vindication, but he knew the fight wasn't over. With the evidence in hand, Rebecca began drafting a formal complaint to the city and preparing for a lawsuit against Margaret and the SAA. Ethan, meanwhile, continued to rally his neighbors, urging them to stand up against the corruption that had taken root in their community. As he stood on his porch that evening, looking out at the wreckage of the Mustang, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret had underestimated him, and she was about to learn that some battles couldn't be won with threats and bulldozers. This was his home, his life, and he wasn't going to let her take it away. The tranquility of Ethan's evenings had been replaced by constant unease. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every faint sound outside his window set him on edge. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a petty tyrant hiding behind SAA bylaws anymore. She was escalating her tactics, and Ethan could feel the noose tightening. The debris left in his driveway was a clear message that Margaret wasn't done with him yet, but Ethan wasn't done either. The week had been a whirlwind of progress on the legal front. Rebecca had filed the initial complaint against Margaret and the SAA, presenting evidence of the fraudulent boundary changes and the clear connection to Silverstone developments. It was enough to launch an investigation into the SAA's practices, but Ethan knew Margaret wouldn't take it lying down, and she didn't. It started with subtle annoyances. A notice appeared in his mailbox claiming he owed back dues to the SAA, a laughable claim since he wasn't and never had been a member. The amount was absurdly high, $15,000. The letter threatened a lien on his property if payment wasn't made within 30 days. Ethan crumpled it and tossed it aside, refusing to be baited. The next night, he came home to find a city inspector waiting in his driveway. The man, wearing a high-visibility vest and carrying a clipboard, informed Ethan that there had been an anonymous complaint about code violations on his property. The inspector was polite but firm, walking the perimeter of Ethan's land with a critical eye. When he was done, he handed Ethan a list of supposed infractions: an unsafe shed, overgrown vegetation near the fence line, and an unapproved structure, the remains of the carport Margaret had destroyed. Ethan bit back his frustration and asked for a copy of the complaint. The inspector shook his head. "Anonymous," he said. "I don't need to ask who's behind it." Margaret was using every tool at her disposal to pressure him, and the inspection was just another weapon in her arsenal. Still, Ethan wasn't about to let her win. He spent the next morning cleaning up the property, trimming the bushes and cutting back the vegetation by the fence. The shed, which had been perfectly fine before, required a few hours of repairs to bring it up to code. By the time he finished, Ethan was exhausted, but the sense of accomplishment was worth it. He refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing him falter, but Margaret wasn't done. The day after the inspection, Ethan woke to the sound of a loud crash outside. He rushed to the front door and found his mailbox lying in pieces on the ground, its posts snapped clean in half. Tire tracks in the dirt indicated someone had deliberately backed over it. Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. This was more than harassment. It was intimidation. He spent the morning installing a new mailbox, this time reinforcing it with a metal post and concrete base. As he worked, he felt eyes on him. Turning toward the street, he saw Margaret's silver Toyota parked a few houses down, the tinted windows revealing nothing. Ethan's skin prickled. She wasn't even trying to hide her involvement anymore. That night, Ethan decided he couldn't afford to sit idly by any longer. Margaret had gone too far, and it was time to take the fight to her. Armed with his growing collection of evidence, Ethan reached out to several of his neighbors, focusing on those who had shared stories of their own run-ins with Margaret. He proposed a meeting at his house, hoping to unite them against the SAA's abuses. The turnout surprised him. Nearly a dozen people showed up, some bringing documents, others just wanting to vent about their experiences. One elderly woman named Linda recounted how Margaret had fined her for planting unauthorized flowers in her front yard. Another neighbor, a young couple, revealed that they had been charged thousands of dollars in fines for minor infractions like leaving their garbage bins out overnight. The stories painted a picture of the SAA operating like a dictatorship, with Margaret at its helm. Ethan listened carefully, jotting down notes and making copies of any documents they were willing to share. As the meeting progressed, a sense of solidarity began to form among the group. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the sense of unity was short-lived. The next morning, Ethan woke to find the remnants of a fire smoldering near the edge of his property. Someone had piled brush and garbage there and set it ablaze during the night. The fire hadn't spread far thanks to the damp ground, but the message was clear. Margaret, or someone working on her behalf, was escalating the pressure. Ethan called the fire department to document the incident and filed a report with the police, though he knew it was unlikely to lead anywhere. Without direct evidence linking Margaret to the fire, it was just another unexplained act of vandalism. Still, the incident only strengthened his resolve. Later that day, Rebecca called with news. "I filed a motion to depose Margaret," she said. "If we can get her under oath, she'll have to answer questions about her connection to Silverstone and those boundary changes. It's a strong move, but it'll take time to schedule." Time wasn't something Ethan felt he had. Margaret was becoming more desperate, and the lengths she was willing to go were growing more dangerous. That night, Ethan installed additional cameras around his property, focusing on the areas near the fence line and driveway. He also reinforced the locks on his doors and windows, knowing that Margaret's tactics could escalate to something more direct. His precautions paid off sooner than he expected. 2 nights later, the cameras captured footage of 2 men sneaking onto his property. One carried a spray can, the other a crowbar. They moved toward Ethan's shed, whispering to each other as they worked. Ethan watched the live feed on his phone, his adrenaline surging. He grabbed the shotgun he kept in his bedroom and quietly stepped out onto the porch, staying in the shadows. "Hey!" he barked, his voice cutting through the night. The men froze, the crowbar clattering to the ground. Ethan raised the shotgun, aiming it squarely at them. Said, "You've got 5 seconds to leave my property before I call the cops." The men scrambled, tripping over themselves as they fled toward the street. Ethan didn't lower the shotgun until they disappeared into the darkness. He reviewed the footage later, zooming in on their faces. One of them was vaguely familiar, a man he'd seen working on Margaret's lawn a few weeks ago. The next morning, Ethan sent the footage to Rebecca, along with a detailed account of what had happened. "This is it," she said. "We can use this to argue that Margaret is creating a hostile environment and endangering her neighbors. Combined with everything else, this significantly strengthens our case." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret still had something up her sleeve. She'd been too brazen, too confident, as if she believed she was untouchable. But Ethan wasn't about to let her win. He'd come too far, and he was ready for whatever came next. The second escalation had pushed Ethan to his limits, but it had also revealed something important. Margaret's desperation was her weakness. The more she pushed, the more careless she became, and Ethan was determined to use that to his advantage. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he had the upper hand. The air in the crowded community hall was thick with tension as Ethan stood at the front of the room, his evidence neatly stacked on the table beside him. The meeting had been called by Margaret Hayes, ostensibly to address misunderstandings and complaints about the SAA. It was a classic move to frame herself as the voice of reason while portraying Ethan as a troublemaker. But Ethan had no intention of letting her control the narrative. Margaret arrived fashionably late, her silver blazer immaculate and her expression exuding confidence. She swept into the room, her clipboard tucked under her arm, and took her place at the center of the table, flanked by 2 members of the SAA board. Her supporters, carefully chosen allies among the residents, filled the front rows, their whispers of approval echoing through the hall. "Good evening, everyone," Margaret began, her voice smooth and composed. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. As you know, our community thrives on cooperation and mutual respect. Unfortunately, recent events have created some discord, and I feel it's important to address these matters openly." Ethan watched her carefully, his jaw tight. She was setting the stage, positioning herself as the savior of the neighborhood. He waited, letting her dig herself deeper. I understand that some residents feel the SAA's actions have been overly strict, Margaret continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward Ethan. But every decision we make is in service of maintaining the high standards that make this neighborhood a desirable place to live. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "High standards," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Destroying my car was about high standards. Setting fires on my property was about high standards." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. "Mr. Collins, I understand you're upset, but these accusations are baseless. The SAA acted within its authority to address a vehicle that was in clear violation of our guidelines." "Save it," Ethan interrupted, stepping forward. He held up a flash drive. "I have proof. Proof that you've been lying to everyone here, abusing your power, and using the SAA to line your pockets." Margaret's face hardened. "Mr. Collins, this is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" Ethan demanded. "Using your position as SAA president to help your husband's company seize people's homes? Redrawing boundaries, fabricating violations, and intimidating your neighbors into selling their properties for peanuts?" The crowd erupted into murmurs, some of Margaret's supporters exchanging uncertain glances, others staring at the screen with a mix of disbelief and anger. Margaret straightened her shoulders, her voice sharp as she said, "These are outrageous claims. Unless you have evidence to support them, I suggest you sit down before you embarrass yourself further." Ethan smirked. "Oh, I've got evidence, plenty of it." He handed the flash drive to a community member who had volunteered to operate the projector. Moments later, the screen behind him lit up, displaying security footage of Margaret operating the bulldozer that had destroyed his Mustang. The crowd gasped. "That's just the beginning," Ethan said, pacing in front of the screen. "The next image is a close-up of the fraudulent map Margaret showed me, followed by documents showing payments from Silverstone Developments to Margaret's personal account." He continued, playing footage of the two men trespassing on his property, including the moment one of them mentioned Margaret's name. "Margaret Hayes isn't protecting this community," Ethan declared, turning to face the crowd. "She's selling it out. Every decision she makes, every fine she issues, is part of a plan to drive people out and hand their homes over to Silverstone Developments, her husband's company." Margaret's carefully constructed mask cracked. Her face flushed, and she rose from her seat, her voice trembling with fury. "This is a smear campaign. He's twisting facts and spreading lies." "Lies," Ethan countered, stepping closer to her. "The payments are right there. The boundary changes are right there. You think these people are stupid, Margaret? You think they're just going to believe you over their own eyes?" Margaret's allies looked increasingly uncomfortable, some whispering among themselves, others staring at the screen with a mix of disbelief and anger. One man in the back stood and said, "My mother lost her house last year because of you. Now I understand why." Another voice joined in, then another, until the room was filled with shouts of outrage. Margaret tried to regain control, her voice rising above the chaos. "You have no right to accuse me of these things. Everything I've done has been within the law." "Then why are you so nervous?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Why did you try to intimidate me? Why did you send those men to vandalize my property?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of the evidence and the crowd's growing anger was too much. She turned to the SAA board members for support, but they avoided her gaze, clearly unwilling to stand by her. Ethan crossed his arms, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "You're done, Margaret. The investigation into you and Silverstone is already underway. It's over." Margaret stood frozen for a moment before grabbing her clipboard and storming out of the room. The slam of the door echoed through the hall, followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then, one by one, the residents began clapping. The applause grew louder, turning into cheers as they stood in support of Ethan. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. Margaret's reign was over, and the neighborhood had finally seen her for what she truly was. The fight wasn't entirely over. There were still legal battles ahead. But this was a victory, one he had fought hard for, and one he wouldn't forget. The fallout from the meeting was swift and decisive. Margaret Hayes's meticulously curated image as the neighborhood's guardian of order and harmony crumbled under the weight of Ethan's evidence. By the next morning, word had spread through the community like wildfire. Her once loyal supporters abandoned her, neighbors whispered about her corruption, and the SAA board scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Margaret resigned from her position as SAA president within 24 hours, citing personal reasons, but the damage had already been done. Investigators from the city planning office confirmed that the boundary changes she had pushed through were riddled with irregularities, and a deeper probe into Silverstone developments revealed their involvement in predatory practices. The financial ties between Margaret and Silverstone were undeniable, and lawsuits began piling up against both her and the company. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. Margaret's downfall couldn't bring back the years of effort he had poured into his Mustang or erase the frustration and anger he'd endured. But as he stood in his driveway, looking at the wreckage of the carport and the mangled remains of his once pristine car, he felt a sense of closure. The battle had been worth it. Over the following weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild. With the settlement money he received from the SAA, he ordered parts and tools to begin restoring the Mustang. Though the task was daunting, Ethan wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Each dent he hammered out, each piece of warped metal he replaced, felt like reclaiming a part of himself. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering words of encouragement or bringing coffee and snacks. Many had been inspired by Ethan's fight and were determined to ensure that the SAA never abused its power again. The final blow to Margaret came when her house, her prized fortress of suburban perfection, was listed for sale. Rumors swirled about her moving to another state, though most suspected she was simply running from the humiliation. Silverstone Developments, too, faced a reckoning with city officials imposing heavy fines and revoking permits for several pending projects. The neighborhood, once gripped by fear and compliance, began to heal. Months later, Ethan's Mustang stood proudly in his driveway once more. It wasn't perfect. There were still small imperfections from the damage, reminders of the battle he had fought. But to Ethan, it was more than just a car. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to standing up against corruption and bullying. The neighborhood came together for a barbecue to celebrate the new beginnings. The event was hosted in Ethan's yard, his rebuilt Mustang taking center stage. Residents who had once kept their heads down now mingled freely, laughing and sharing stories. Ethan, standing by his car with a drink in hand, felt a rare sense of peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, a neighbor approached Ethan, a young couple who had just moved in. The husband looked at the Mustang with wide eyes, his admiration clear. "That's a beautiful car," he said. "You don't see many like that anymore." Ethan smiled, running a hand along the polished hood. "This one's been through hell," he said, "but it's still standing." The couple nodded, and the wife added, "So is this neighborhood." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He looked out over the gathering, neighbors united and free from Margaret's oppressive shadow. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for all of them. Ethan raised his drink in a silent toast to the Mustang, the neighborhood, and the hard-won peace they had finally achieved.